Well, good morning, and thank you all for being here for the second meeting of the National Space Council. I want to thank all the members who are here, the members of our user advisory group, and all of those who have taken time to join us in person and online. We'll go ahead and get started. Today we have two panel discussions on the challenges and opportunities facing our national security and commercial space activities that I just spoke about in my opening remarks. We're pleased to be joined by an outstanding lineup of expert witnesses who will share their insights and expertise with the Council in the moments ahead. But first off, I'd like to ask some of the Council members to provide updates on the progress that we've made since our first meeting to implement President Trump's vision for American leadership in space. I'm going to begin with our National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster. General, I want to commend you first and foremost and the National Security Agency for your efforts in support of the National Space Council. I specifically want to thank General Bill Lickery of the National Security Council for his extraordinary work on the Space Strategic Framework. Could you please give the Council an overview of that work?
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and thank you for the opportunity to provide an update on the important progress we have made in developing the new strategy for space. And I want to thank, first of all, fellow council members here for their tremendous collaboration and teamwork. As you noted, Mr. Vice President, at the last Space Council meeting in October, you approved the strategic framework for the new strategy, and I thought it might be useful for our audience to briefly summarize that framework and what we've done with that framework since then. As a reminder, the framework contained three key elements. First, it defined our vital interests in space to ensure unfettered access to and freedom to operate in the space domain to advance the security, economic prosperity, and scientific knowledge of the nation. Second, it set a desired end state for the new strategy to ensure U.S. leadership, preeminence, and freedom of action in space for decades to come. And finally, it outlined four strategic objectives in pursuit of our vital interests. They are, first, to strengthen the safety, stability, and sustainability of space activities. Second, to deter and, when necessary, defeat adversary space and counter-space threats that are hostile to the national interests of the United States and our allies. Third, to partner with the U.S. commercial sector to ensure that American companies remain the leading providers of traditional and innovative space technologies, goods, and services on the international space market. And fourth, to maintain and extend U.S. human presence and robotic explorations beyond Earth to transform knowledge of ourselves, the planet, our solar system, and the universe. So since October, at your direction, Mr. Vice President, we have developed the lines of effort and identified the specific associated tasks to meet the strategic objectives, achieve our desired end state, and advance our vital interests in space. The four interrelated lines of efforts are: first, mission assurance. We will accelerate the transformation of our space architecture by deliberately moving systems from science and technology phase to research and development phase to actual fielding of capabilities. As a result, our space systems will be more resilient, more defendable, more easily reconstituted, and better serviced to orbit. Our second line of effort is on deterrence and warfighting. Due to competitor and adversary actions, the space domain is increasingly contested. Space has now joined land, sea, and air as a warfighting domain. While we prefer the conflict not extend to space, the United States will be prepared if it does. Our third line of effort is on organizational support. We will pursue improved foundational capabilities, structures, and processes to enable more effective space operations. And our fourth and final line of effort focuses on conducive environments, both at home and abroad. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, Mr. Vice President, we have work to do. Domestically, this includes streamlining the regulatory environment to better use and support U.S. industry. Internationally, this includes pursuing bilateral and multilateral engagements to enable human exploration, promote burden sharing, and foster cooperation against threatening adversary space actions. Mr. Vice President, like our audience today and like the panels that you'll see here today, these efforts cut across national security, commercial, and civil space sectors. And the strategy will not only advance the benefits of space for ourselves, but also ensure that peoples of all nations can benefit from the tremendous potential that space offers. I should note that the President's recent budget submission, since Mick Mulvaney's not here, it increases the funding for DoD space programs by over $1 billion in fiscal year 2019 alone, and by $8 billion over the next 5 years. NASA's budget for 2019 is being increased by $300 million, while also being restructured to focus more on exploration. With your endorsement, Mr. Vice President, and the President's approval, we are prepared to begin implementing this national strategy for space and periodically assess progress and recommend adjustments to you and to the Council and the President. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Great. Thank you, General, and thank you for the great collaboration between the National Space Council and the National Security Council. It's been seamless, and we appreciate your update for this meeting. The Acting Administrator of NASA, Robert Lightfoot, has been busy implementing the Space Policy Directive, and also that direction from the President guided the development of the President's budget submission. Perhaps you could give us a brief overview of the budget presentation and the implementation of the directive.
Will do. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. And fellow council members, especially those of you that worked with us on this development of this answer and action to the Space Policy Directive 1. What we did in developing this initiative was we came up with what we call the Exploration Campaign. This Exploration Campaign is a national and agency effort focused on 3 core domains: low Earth orbit, lunar orbit and the surface of the moon, and Mars and other deep space objectives. The goals of this campaign are to transition the U.S. human spaceflight in low Earth orbit to commercial operations, which supports NASA and the needs of an emerging private sector market, extend our long-duration U.S. human spaceflight operations to the lunar vicinity, enable long-term robotic exploration of the moon, both scientific and human, as we move forward, in preparation for further missions taking humans to Mars. The objectives in there, first of all, we'll start with low Earth orbit. Again, as I said, we want to end direct support to the ISS by 2025 while stimulating commercial industry to develop capabilities NASA and the private sector can utilize and meet NASA's exploration risk mitigation and scientific requirements. Starting in 2018, we'll increase the breadth and depth of the commercial and international low Earth orbit activities. Specifically, we'll offer to expand the International Space Station partnerships to new nations based on inputs from our current ISS and commercial stakeholders. We'll shape the plan to transition the International Space Station as we've been asked to go do. And we'll extend the public-private partnerships to help develop and demonstrate the technologies and capabilities that the new commercial products can be brought to bear in low Earth orbit. At the moon, we have 2 objectives, of course. It's the long-term presence in the vicinity of the moon and on the moon. Again, both scientifically and from a human perspective. In the lunar orbit, we'll conduct the first uncrewed mission of the SLS Orion, first flight in 2020 to the moon, and the crewed flight in 2023. We intend to establish a human-tended lunar orbiting platform for crews to visit from Earth, to transit to and from the lunar surface, and to depart to, ultimately, return to Mars. We'll develop the Lunar Orbiting Platform Gateway that at a minimum, it puts a power propulsion element out there and begins to put the habitat that we're going to need to stay in when we go there. At the surface, we'll orchestrate a lunar robotics campaign with a focus on the growing a commercial base of partnerships and activity that can support U.S. science, technology, and exploration objectives. And we'll include international participation where appropriate. We'll support a small commercial lander initiative with initial strategic presence on the moon no later than 2020. Develop a mid to large scale lander initiative working toward human rating a lander in the future. This initiative will focus on enabling, again, commercial and international partnerships. We'll also support an early science and technology initiative that includes CubeSats, lunar CubeSats, a virtual lunar institute, and other activities. This will further enable and nurture the entrepreneurial and commercial market forces that'll define the long-term human exploration and advancement of the lunar service. For Mars and other deep space objectives that we have, we really want to maintain and grow the U.S. leadership at Mars. We have a rover going in 2020 as a first step to demonstrate sample return strategy. It also is going to take an experiment that's going to tell us whether we can produce oxygen from the atmosphere at Mars. Very exciting mission for us then. We'll use this mission as a building block for subsequent round-trip robotic missions with hopefully the first historic launch off of another planet and a sample return through the lunar gateway that we're building. Again, broadening the exploration architecture as we move forward. We'll prioritize these investments to guide us and really align, as General McMaster said, really align toward exploration. There's a tremendous focus there for us as we move forward. So that's kind of the nuance in the response to SPD-1. And I think what you'll find, Mr. Vice President, is this NASA team, your industry team, and our international partners are ready to get started. So thanks for your support in the 2019 budget. We did see the increase, and we're ready to go do this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Well done. We want to thank the National Security Council and NASA for doing such a great job responding to the 45-day reporting period. Not a lot happens in the federal government in 45 days, but you all did outstanding work reflecting the President's urgency on this effort. Two others that have done excellent work are the Commerce and the Transportation Department. The Transportation is represented by Deputy Secretary Rosen, and of course Secretary Wilbur Ross is with us from the Commerce Department. Jeff, if you want to give us a quick update, I know that Secretary Chow could not be with us today, but could you give us a quick update on some of the recommended changes that Transportation has been working through, particularly with regard to commerce, with regard to private space exploration and development?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm so pleased to be here with the Space Council, and all of us from the Department of Transportation very much appreciate and are grateful for your leadership. Secretary Chow was unable to make it today, but she asked that I make very clear that the Department of Transportation is strongly committed to regulatory streamlining and modernizing our commercial space regulatory framework. As was mentioned at the previous meeting of the Council, you asked us, along with OMB and the Department of Commerce, to prepare a new 45-day plan to overhaul, modernize, and streamline our somewhat rusty commercial space licensing framework. So we've worked hard to do that, and we've come up with some structural and meaningful changes to the status quo. And I hope the work we did, in combination with our colleagues on the Council and other agencies, will meet your approval. There are 5 main elements that I just want to touch on briefly today. The first is we want to implement accelerated rulemaking plans, meaning that we shorten the timelines that the FAA and the department are working on to meet the ambitious schedule that you and the Council have set out. Second is we want to provide some immediate interim relief, such as the expanded use of waivers and programmatic approvals where they're appropriate, so that we can try to right away begin facilitating the objectives of the Council. A third piece of the plan is to focus FAA resources so that we strengthen the portion of the FAA that most directly deals with licensing and the regulatory approvals so that we can accomplish the goals that have been set out. A fourth item is to establish a joint task force. The purpose of this is to facilitate better coordination within the U.S. government so that people that need regulatory approvals don't face confusing situations as to who's doing what and how to get the approvals they need. But then the fifth piece, and perhaps the most important, is a new licensing framework. As was set out in Recommendation 1 for today's meeting, our ultimate aim is a 21st century file and fly kind of licensing framework, and the plan includes specific new regulatory deadlines and approaches in the aim of getting us to a file and fly type regulatory approach as quickly as possible. So we look forward to implementing this changed approach and delivering on a more responsive, easier to navigate, and sensible commercial space regulatory framework, and very much look forward to working with all the folks on this council and others to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. With that, let me recognize the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, who I know has been working very closely with Secretary Chow to achieve exactly the streamlining, the objectives, and the reorganization that we've discussed. Mr. Secretary, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, members of the National Space Council, Users Advisory Group, and distinguished guests. Recently, here at Cape Canaveral, SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket was launched. 2 first-stage boosters disengaged on schedule and in unison landed back here. This was their second use. You saw one of them as you came in. It will be ready for its 3rd launch, an amazing technological and commercial feat. Thanks to impressive events such as this, the United States is the leader in space once again. Somewhere out there in space, there's a bright red roadster going thousands of miles per hour, the fastest car in history. We had better keep up with it. Space is already a $330 billion industry supporting 211,000 American jobs. But our share of the 1,700 new companies created worldwide last year was only 45%, far lower than our share of launches. Private companies funded $3.9 billion of our space effort last year, but they're competing against 70 foreign governments, so they need all the support we can give them. Countries new to space have an inherent advantage in terms of the regulatory environment because they carry no baggage from the earlier, simpler days of space. In contrast, much of our remote sensing regulatory regime is 25 years old. Space 25 years ago bears little resemblance to space today. Now the rate of innovation is extraordinary, so we need an adaptive and relatively permissive regulatory system. NOAA, FAA, FCC, and other agencies each have a role, and they all have obligations to DOD, the IC, and state as well. That complexity inherently causes delay. Since the Council's first meeting in October, Commerce's review of the outdated regulatory framework and discussions with an ambitious but frustrated space industry made it clear that the rate of regulatory change must match the rate of technological change. That is how we will ensure that businesses choose the United States as their flag of choice for space. So at the department, we're working to create a new one-stop shop for space commerce. Mr. Vice President, with the Council's direction, I will move the Office of Space Commerce and the Commercial Remote Sensing Regulatory Affairs Office from NOAA to my direct oversight in the Office of the Secretary. This elevated and amplified Office of Space Commerce will coordinate all space-related functions at the department, remote sensing, spectrum policy, export controls, business and trade promotion, to name a few. In addition to the proposed relocation of the Office of Space Commerce, we will also soon name a director of that office. Also, we are providing to the Bureau of Industry and Security and the NTIA additional funding for their space-focused activities. And our foreign commercial service teams, located in 105 cities around the world, will recruit foreign space businesses to our country. Space will be featured during our Select USA conference in June, which last year attracted 3,000 foreign participants. The department further proposes to the Space Council that all space commerce responsibilities other than launch and re-entry licensing be consolidated into the Department of Commerce. We further recommend that the President direct the Office of Space Commerce to develop, in concert with the Council and industry players, regulations and legislation for an effective mission authorization framework for all commercial activities in space. We pledge to make those proposals no later than July 1. Activities such as asteroid mining, space tourism, and space habitation are quickly becoming much more than science fiction, and we need a future-oriented space commerce agenda and a supportive regulatory regime. With input and guidance from the Space Council, the Department of Commerce can be the one-stop shop the industry so sorely needs. In addition, the department recommends that the Departments of Commerce, State, and Defense continue their efforts to simplify existing commercial remote sensing licensing regimes. That process must be made more efficient and predictable. Satellite companies now face a permitting timeline that can take 5 years, is undefined, indefinite, and provides no certainty or predictability to industry. This is unacceptable and must change. Otherwise, companies and customers will go overseas. There are at least 2 other areas where commerce can play an important role for American leadership in space. These are in spectrum policy and export licensing. Spectrum is a scarce resource that facilitates communications, control, and transmission of valuable data back to Earth. The National Space Council should recommend that the department be directed to develop and advocate for spectrum policies to support commercial space activities while respecting the needs of DoD and others. Finally, Commerce recommends that the Space Council and the Executive Secretary review export licensing regulations affecting commercial space activity. Today, a space vehicle that returns to Earth in international waters or non-U.S. territory is treated as an export of sensitive and dangerous technology. This approach is a primary complaint of space companies. And if the President approves our recommendations, we will continue working with our colleagues at State and DoD to enable more commercial activity while protecting national security. That little red Tesla in outer space does need rules of the road, but there shouldn't be too many one-way streets, dead ends, or U-turns. I promise you, commerce will be a good steward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Wilbur. Thank you for your great work and the department's great work in this area. We'll speak to your recommendations momentarily, but I think everyone looking on can tell the great collaboration between the Department of Commerce and the Department of Transportation, and appreciates very much the work done. We'll turn our attention now to Administrator Rao. Thank you for being here today. Most people may not be aware of how important your job is to this industry at the Office of Management and Budget. You lead the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. It's critical to the work of this council. I want to thank Director Mulvaney, who has been working tirelessly to move the President's agenda on streamlining regulatory regimes. Could you give us a quick overview of what you've been working toward at the office to support this effort?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. It's a pleasure to be here with members of the Cabinet, the Space Council, and other distinguished guests for this very exciting and ambitious event. So as you mentioned, I'm the administrator at OIRA, which is the office that reviews all of the significant regulatory actions across the government. And in a nutshell, what we really do is we try to ensure that regulations serve the American people. And since the Reagan administration, we help agencies meet presidential priorities, such as what we're talking about today, the commitment to winning the next frontier of space. So, Mr. Vice President, as you've already said so well, there are tremendous opportunities here to use space for security and commercial purposes. But the success of these ambitious ventures will depend in part on a regulatory system that does not stand in the way of progress, but instead enables innovation, provides clarity, and ensures safety. And these goals with respect to space development are consistent with President Trump's overall direction to reduce cumulative regulatory burdens across the government. As an administration, we want to advance a regulatory and that leaves individuals and businesses as free as possible to innovate and to create the technology of the future. These general principles apply across the board, but really have particular importance in areas of emerging technology, such as space exploration. And here we start with the basic idea that government shouldn't be picking winners and losers through regulation. We don't want to regulate in a way that freezes technological development or stifles innovation through government prescriptions. And as Secretary Ross and Deputy Secretary Rosen have already mentioned, important reform begins first by identifying some of the problems with existing regulatory frameworks. We need to find those regulations that are duplicative, outdated, or just simply ineffective, and then work hard to eliminate or streamline those burdens. And in areas where multiple agencies impose overlapping burdens, such as in licensing or paperwork reporting, we are reconsidering how those requirements can be combined or replaced. And in part because of our centralized role at OIRA, we can address issues that span multiple agencies to eliminate and streamline unnecessary requirements. And that simply will allow more resources to be devoted to research and production rather than regulatory red tape. And we're confident that we can do this for space development because we have done this in other regulatory areas. The President has demonstrated tremendous leadership in this area and directed significant and meaningful regulatory reform since the outset of the administration. His early executive order called for eliminating 2 regulations for each new one, and as of the last fiscal year, we were actually at 22 deregulatory actions for each new one. And in this coming year, agencies have proposed even more deregulatory actions and projecting a regulatory cost savings of over $10 billion. So in the past, regulatory burdens have steadily increased over time, but this administration has really turned the tide with its regulatory reform initiatives. And so in areas of burgeoning technology, such as space development, this means individuals and companies can proceed with confidence that we're not going to spring new regulatory requirements on them that will stifle growth. We want to contribute to a regulatory environment that can enhance development of space. And with the right frameworks, we're confident that private companies can unleash creativity and ingenuity. And we can enhance American global leadership by attracting investments in research and development for space. Of course, with further advances into space, we face important questions about security, safety, sovereignty. But with the work of the Space Council, OIRA remains committed to working across the government to design regulations that meet these needs while furthering our journey to the next frontiers of space. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Naomi. Well done. Okay, we're approaching the end of the first half of our presentation. Before we move to panels, I would recommend members in your packets today. You have several recommendations to the President for approval. Recommendation 1 directs the Department of Transportation to replace prescriptive launch and reentry licensing regimes with a streamlined system by March 1, 2019, to be completed at that point on or before. Recommendation 2 directs the Department of Commerce to consolidate all space commerce responsibilities in the Office of the Secretary, as Wilbur described, and also develop a system that facilitates mission authorization for commercial space activities. There are other recommendations related to that the Secretary enumerated quite well. Recommendation 3 directs the National Telecommunication Information Administration and Commerce to work with the FCC to develop protections for the radio frequency spectrum, facilitating commercial space activities. And Recommendation 4 directs the Executive Secretary of the Council, in coordination with all the members of the Council, to develop recommendations to streamline export control regulatory requirements by 1st of January 2019, also as the Secretary described. If there are no objections or questions, seeing none, I would, as Chairman, direct the Executive Secretary to include these recommendations in a decision memorandum for the President of the United States. Secretary Ross and Deputy Secretary Rosen, at our meeting later this year, I'd also like you to support or report to the Council the details of the progress that we are making against the President's decision and completion of the decision memorandum. Would you join me in thanking all of these terrific leaders for the job that they're doing? They've done a great work. Well, before we call our panel up, we're going to move to our first panel entitled Securing the Next Frontier, with a focus on national security. And I'm particularly pleased to have a number of distinguished Americans who will be presenting, and I'll introduce them momentarily, but they're invited to take their seats. Before we hear from our panelists, I'd like to ask Susan Gordon, who I have and the President have come to know and greatly respect. She is the Principal Deputy Director for National Intelligence for the United States. And Susan, maybe you could give us a brief overview of the security challenges that the United States faces in the space environment today.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm delighted to be here today representing the women and men of the intelligence community. You know, we are drivers and practitioners and users of U.S. space. In fact, our history and space history are inextricably bound, and we see the same excitement that you articulated in your remarks about this moment. And they're resplendent with opportunity, even as Vice President. As your resident intelligence officer, I often bring the sobering information to any meeting. And so today what I thought I'd do is to spend a few minutes and just describe the plans and actions of foreign adversaries and competitors who would seek to impede our operations or challenge our advantage. Russia and China are each developing counter-space capabilities to use during a potential future conflict with the United States to reduce U.S. and allied advantage and effectiveness, eroding our information advantage. Both countries have robust jamming and cyber attack capabilities today and can threaten our satellite ground infrastructure. Russian and China destructive anti-satellite weapons, including missiles, lasers, and orbital weapons, will probably reach initial operation capability in the next few years. Russian lawmakers have promoted military pursuit of anti-satellite missiles to strike low Earth orbiting satellites, and Russia is testing such a weapon. Both Russia and China are developing laser anti-satellite weapons to dazzle or damage sensitive space-based optical sensors. And Russia and China continue to conduct sophisticated on-orbit activities, such as rendezvous and proximity operations that are intended to advance counter-space capabilities. Military reforms in China and Russia over the past few years indicate an increased focus on establishing operational aerospace forces and integrating attacks against space systems and services with military operations in other domains. China's People Liberation Army has formed counter-space military units and begun operational training with counter-space systems, including the ground-launched anti-satellite missile that was initially tested in 2007. Now, the idea of space threats also includes the use of space to enable or empower military operations on the Earth's surface. Foreign countries will continue to improve their military and dual-use reconnaissance, communications, and navigation systems in terms of the numbers of satellites, the breadth of their capability, and the application for use. And other nation-state and non-state actors will gain access to advanced space-enabled technology in the coming years as the global space industry expands. They will increasingly have access to weather, communications, navigation, and timing data for intelligence and military purposes. The panel will do a great job of making my next point, but I'll briefly state that I'd like to call the attention to China's impressive rise, and it is impressive, as a space power. They've increased the number of their active satellites by more than an order of magnitude since 2000, and a result of Beijing's strong investment in its satellite and rocket manufacturing capability. China's satellite technology has become increasingly sophisticated, and a case in point is the success that China has achieved in world-leading ground-to-space quantum communications experiments. I think in sum, China has the best politically supported and best resourced foreign space program that we have seen in many years, and its years of intense activity are beginning to bear fruit. I think the panel is perfectly placed to help us put all this in context. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Very insightful. Sue is a great American, and thank you for that candid and bracing overview. With that, we'll turn to our panelists. Let me introduce all of them and then invite you to welcome them. Mr. Dean Cheng is with the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Jeffrey Manber is the President and CEO of Nanorex Corporation. Our third panelist is Dr. Bovya Lal of the Institute of Defense Analysis, Science and Technology Policy Institute. Join me in welcoming all of our panelists, would you please? Thank you all. I'd like to invite, starting with Dean Cheng, I'd like to invite you to bring a few brief remarks, but of course all of your prepared remarks will be submitted for the public record, and then we'll look forward to briefly giving our council members an opportunity to ask questions. But thank you all for being here.
Good morning, Mr. Vice President, members of the Space Council, National Space Council. My name is Dean Cheng. The views I expressed in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as reflecting the official position of the Heritage Foundation. During the Cold War, there were only two major space powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and they had roughly symmetric interests and approaches to space. Like so much of international security, the post-Cold War world is much more complex. There are more space players today, including a growing set of non-state and commercial actors. At the same time, the American dependence on space has broadened. The U.S. military depends upon space-based systems for the American way of war. Financial institutions, farmers, and Amazon all increasingly depend on space systems for their day-to-day operations. Given this dependence, revisionist powers and security competitors are likely to target American space systems as an essential means of countering American economic and military capability. This evolving set of circumstances for both space and American security is reflected in the growing challenge posed by other space powers, and especially the People's Republic of China. The PRC has pursued a set of space policies that do not parallel American or Soviet ones, and it is now exploiting not only new technologies, to expand its space capabilities, but also undertaking new organizational approaches and innovations. Some of the key characteristics of the Chinese Space Challenge include, first and foremost, that China is fundamentally a major space power. China possesses all of the key elements required for supporting a major space presence. Above all, it has the political will to support and sustain national commitments to space. China has also committed the industrial, financial, and human capital to translate those desires into today's array of satellites, boosters, and launch sites. And it is important to note that those systems are largely indigenously designed and constructed. China may engage in all sorts of industrial espionage, but much of its space program is indigenous and homegrown. China's space program has a very heavy military component. The basic reality is that when we interact with China's space program, we are essentially interacting with China's military. China's space facilities, personnel, and programs are largely drawn from that military. Its facilities are PLA bases, their staffs are PLA personnel, and the heads of key programs, such as the China Manned Space Engineering Office, are drawn from the military. China's space program, however, also reflects its approach to dual use and civil-military integration. China's space industrial complex is not so much a revolving door as a broad atrium for Chinese aerospace engineers and managers amidst all of these state-owned enterprises. And the result is far closer to a single integrated space enterprise with relatively few demarcations between the military and civilian. This reality will likely apply to China's emerging set of commercial space entities as well. China is actively promoting the development of new commercial space companies that range from those supported by state-owned enterprises to more independent private firms. But given the interest in melding civilian and military capacity, as well as past evidence behavior in the telecom sector, it is vital to recognize that these private firms will at the end of the day respond with alacrity to central government directives. The Chinese model will not be Teslas in space, but Huawei in space. In conclusion, as the United States advances space as a priority domain, it needs to recognize that other states will not only seek to do the same for themselves, but some are also very likely to strive to deny space to the United States in time of crisis and certainly in time of war. These efforts will likely encompass not only direct military action, but efforts at establishing a highly competitive space industrial base, supporting space-oriented technologies, production, and organizational innovation, and undertaking an array of efforts to access American technologies while denying the United States the same. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify before you this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. Jeffrey Manber with Nanoracks Corporation. Thank you for being here. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. For 30 years, good morning, everyone. For 30 years, I've worked to make space just another place to do business. My inspiration, in large part, derives from having worked under Ronald Reagan's Commerce Secretary, Malcolm Baldrige, in the original Office of Space Commerce. So it's good to be here this morning. I started my company, Nanoracks, 8 years ago. We were the first company to own and market our own research services on board the space station. We were the first company to commercially deploy small from the space station. As of today, we have launched over 600 payloads from customers in over 30 countries. Our commercial customers range from the U.S. government to high schools. The U.S. government is a commercial customer, so too the high schools, some of whom do bake sales to support the payloads that go to station. And I'm proud to say, Mr. Vice President, that we've launched 4 high school experiments from Crown Point in Highland, Indiana. So please allow me several observations this morning. First, kudos to the administration and the council for beginning the debate today on the transition from the ISS from a government-owned facility to an era of private space stations. The debate may have been skewed a bit in the headlines, but I believe you are raising the correct questions. How can NASA most effectively leverage the taxpayer investment in ISS? Can commercial industry safely and cost-effectively operate the ISS and other commercial platforms? And we understand it's not black and white, but it is an end to accepting that the government support of ISS is the only pathway. And how will the government in the future behave more and more as a tenant, just the way it is in every other marketplace? So we're very excited by this. Finally, as I look overseas, it's my opinion, as a businessman, as a space businessman, that the United States cannot simply ignore China's commercial space ambitions. China is quietly developing a robust commercial space industry. I say quietly because Americans are barred by our own regulations and our own mindset from participation in this marketplace. As we just heard, large Chinese companies are creating commercial launch efforts, while young Chinese entrepreneurs are raising funds from Silicon Valley on commercial space projects. On a governmental level, our allies have noticed. The European Space Agency has astronauts training to visit the planned Chinese space station, but the U.S. has barred itself from participation. Nanoracks and other companies are prohibited to sell into this marketplace. Avoiding this emerging marketplace, albeit due to justified concerns over technology transfer and other legitimate issues, is not the American global leadership that we all strive to achieve. Now, while my time today is brief, I urge us to negotiate a stern but fair agreement with China and allow U.S. businesses to do what we do best, and that is to innovate and compete better than anyone else. Mr. Vice President and members of the Council, I am thrilled that the administration is focusing on commercial space as part of America's leadership in space exploration. Through the American-style commercial pathway, I am certain we will continue to inspire the next generation of explorers so that one day those students from Crown Point, Indiana, will be standing in front of a future Space Council discussing how the United States commercial lunar base is just another place to do business. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Well said. And Bhavya Lal is recognized, and then we'll move on to questions after your presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Vice President and members of the National Space Council. A discussion on the threats to U.S. competitiveness in space needs to start with the acknowledgement that we are the preeminent space power in the world today. The U.S. government still spends more on space than the rest of the governments in the world combined. The United States has more satellites and other assets in orbit than any other country in the world. The world's currently most powerful rocket launched just 2 weeks ago is a product of American industry. A recent study on global trends in small satellites by my organization, the IDA Science and Technology Policy Institute, found that about 2/3 of the 100 organizations doing the most innovative R&D in the small sat sector are US-based. These advantages cannot, however, be taken for granted, and our leadership in space is increasingly being challenged. Global investments in space have steadily grown over the past 2 decades. A decade ago, for instance, fewer than 50 countries were investing about $40 billion in space. By 2026, 30 more countries are expected to join the Space Club, and global expenditures are expected to double those of 10 years ago. Growing international expenditure is only one development in the space sector. Partially as a result of investments from the US government, there have been dramatic improvements in the technology used in the space sector. In some areas, costs have fallen orders of magnitude. Using a combination of alternative architectures, such as swarms of hundreds of satellites, and business process innovation, relatively inexpensive breadbox-sized satellites are able to nearly match services that were previously feasible only with bus-sized satellites that cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Buoyed by the perception of profitability, space has become an attractive target for private investment, almost $17 billion since 2000 and $4 billion in 2017 alone. As a result, some sectors of space are transitioning from a top-down government-led operation to a globalized industry with worldwide supply chains and customers. Using both domestic investment, and products and services from this rapidly growing private sector, the rest of the world is leapfrogging decades worth of technological development, aiming to build systems that can compete with the United States in many areas, including launch, robotic space operations, and even human exploration. My central point is that threats to U.S. leadership in space have arisen primarily from these structural changes that are enabling many more countries to target and achieve success in space, and there is no turning back the clock. In this environment, maintaining U.S. leadership means that the United States, more than ever, needs to leverage its core competitive advantage, an innovation ecosystem that rewards creativity, entrepreneurship, and risk-taking. Going beyond the fundamentals, there are some space sector-specific actions that would be relevant as well. I propose we begin with 3. Ensure that our regulations empower the U.S. private sector to continue to out-innovate the rest of the world, ensure government spending is more efficient, and invest in capabilities where we absolutely must have overwhelming advantage over other countries. I look forward to contributing to this discussion.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists. I'm going to go to several of our security members of the council who are with us today, but let me maybe direct my first question to Dr. Lal. You have spoken about the challenges that we face. You refer to structural challenges. There's no going back. The United States has to continue to lean in to remain, use your words, a preeminent leader in space. You have written and spoken about space traffic management. Is there a policy decision you would have this council consider related to that? And could you expand on that briefly?
Sure. So space traffic management is a very critical component of our private sector leadership in space, primarily because it gives us the clarity, it gives the companies the clarity they need to do unfettered work in space. It allows us to work collaboratively with other countries, especially if we have a fabric of the management system that joins with each other, and there is agreement across the world as to how we want to go forward to make sure that space is safe and sustainable to operate in.
I've got people who know a lot more about this than me at this table, but it sounds to me like you're calling on the United States to play a wider role in ensuring that we have the same kind of deconfliction agreements that we have in areas of conflict, that we have in terms of issues of navigation on the 7 seas, and that you're suggesting the United States lean into that effort and provide that guidance and drive those agreements?
I absolutely think the United States needs to take a leadership position here.
Yeah. Very, very insightful. Appreciate that very much. The Deputy Secretary of Defense is with us today. Pat Shanahan, Mr. Secretary, would you like to
maybe
pose
just
question?
a quick question there for Dean. Thank you for your remarks this morning. My question is around the civil-military partnerships that you've observed in China, and maybe it's not just civil-military, but industrial-military. Have you seen a different dynamic in the partnerships that we should observe or take notice of?
The Chinese have published extensively on the issues of things like mobilization, where they include things like science and technology mobilization. So there is an explicit organizational structure, regulatory structure, et cetera, for the incorporation of people, equipment, as well as facilities. So when we think about China's space program, we should be thinking of it not simply in terms of the elements that are currently in the military, but the reach back that the Chinese have explicitly talked about in terms of bringing in everything from universities to corporate assets to industrial personnel and equipment.
Great. Thank you.
We're fortunate to have with us today, I know he was formally introduced, but the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford. You could welcome him one more time if you'd like. He is an extraordinary American leader. General.
I have a question for Mr. Manbury. You talked about not allowing concerns over technology transfer to inhibit our progress. But it struck me as I was listening to the recap of the strategy from General McMaster that we are going to have concerns over protecting our intellectual property and our classified information. And I wonder, from an industry perspective, with now 3 decades of experience, you can maybe talk a little bit about how do we get that balance right? Yeah. Because, again, as we implement the strategy, we ought to think about that up front and make sure that we do that. And I'm particularly struck by it because of the brief on China. And although you say that most of their capabilities are indigenous and homegrown, that would actually be unique in Chinese experience, that most of their current modern capabilities are indigenous and homegrown, because I think we know that we've had an intellectual property challenge and a classified information challenge with China. So maybe, Mr. Manbury, you're probably the best one to address that. And again, it's about getting the balance right.
Right. It's a fascinating question, and thank you for it. It's very difficult in our industry to strike the right balance between competitiveness and assuring that America safeguards its technology. But I suppose that we have already worked with NASA very carefully and others to ensure that there's no technology transfer. We work very closely to assure that they learn the Chinese and other of the nations we work with. I said we work with some 30 nations. They've included Vietnam, Peru, and others, that there is no technology transfer, that the guidelines and practices of the International Space Station remain confidential. At the same time, we see that just a few weeks ago, there's Canadian satellites launching with the Chinese. There's Danish companies that are developing satellites that are flying with the Chinese. My point is that if we go in with American leadership and we go in and we can say to the Chinese, here is the issues that we regard as important in IP, copyright protection, technology transfer, there is when we have the greatest strength, starting with a new marketplace to ensure that we get what we need. And as the President has said, we want to revamp and reconsider our relations with China. And so I can see no better opportunity than to do it here, where we're not involved today, but we're clearly leaders of the free world. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen is recognized. Thank you, Kirstjen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Good morning, and thank you to the panelists. My question is just for all of you. As the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, we care deeply about space-based services, everything from the weather and the satellites that we get from NOAA and the Commerce Department, through to our ability to warn our citizens, through to cybersecurity, and then very specific space-based services such as GPS-enabled position navigation and timing. So of concern to me is making sure that as we work with the private sector and as the U.S. government moves forward, that we continue to build in security and resilience into all of our tools. What more can the U.S. government do from your perspective to incentivize, as we go forward, that security and resilience in all of our space-based services upon which we're so heavily reliant?
So I would say it would be helpful for the government to work more with the private sector, especially the part of the private sector that typically hasn't been in the government fold. And one way to do that would be to make sure that the government uses more commercial approaches, things that, not necessarily cost-plus type contracts, but ones that are more solutions or outcome-driven, where there's milestones and payments based on milestones. Another alternative would be, or another activity to add would be to be able to accept 80% solutions, because that would just really improve the aperture with the kind of companies you can work with. We don't always need to have a Ferrari. We can sometimes use a Ford Focus.
I'll just quickly add that from our experience at NanoRacks, we have a very robust relationship with NASA on all levels, and having this sort of partnership is critical. We always are in lockstep with NASA on what we're doing, especially as we go overseas. And you have to, there's emerging throughout the U.S. government great folks who care more than just getting up and doing their job. And this is at DOD, this is at NASA, and they really work with us to make sure that we don't overstep what might be proper. We're always itching to do more, of course. It's the commercial sector. But you have to have the relationships with the government officials and the government folks. And so we really appreciate our relationship with NASA. And so passing this along, I would say it's not something maybe you can codify. You just have to have an organic relationship to be smarter, to be alert, and don't consider the government always as the enemy, but work with them on these sort of critical issues.
Ma'am, I would say that one of the things to keep in mind is that space is part of a larger information ecosystem. The Chinese view space very holistically. When they talk about space and space dominance, they are talking not only about satellites, but ground stations and the data links that tie them all together, as well as the information that passes over it. When we think about resilience, then, we need to be thinking beyond just space. We need to be thinking about redundancies, whether it's things like ELORAN or other alternatives that may not be orbital. And when we think about protecting our space capabilities, it means, again, thinking holistically, because it's really about the information that passes over and through those space systems.
Join me in thanking these outstanding panelists for their insights and participation in the program today. Thank you all. Great job. Great job. Our next panel is entitled Entrepreneurship on the Next Frontier. I'll invite our panelists to go ahead and make your way to the stage. Before we get started, let me just say to all the members of the National Space Council, I think we've heard some very insightful recommendations, and particularly would request General McMaster that if you could develop a plan that identifies additional steps derived from the discussion today that ought to be added to our space strategy. We'll look forward to your presentation on that at the next National Space Council meeting. They've written me some very thoughtful opening remarks about entrepreneurship and the next frontier. But in the interest of time, let me be brief and say President Trump is for it. All right? I was on the phone with the president yesterday, and this businessman turned president of the United States has great pride and great enthusiasm in not only the partnership, the historic partnership between private sector organizations and NASA, but also great pride in the development of new platforms and innovation that we saw just 2 weeks ago here with the Falcon Heavy, and that we see in all the names of all the different rockets that we talked about in my presentation today. I was at the Mojave Desert and visited another American spaceport, and I can't help but think 100 years from now that it will be our private sector pioneers that help lift America into this new era of space exploration, just as American pioneers have done in the past. So that said, I just want to express a great enthusiasm for President Trump, great gratitude to this distinguished panel. And let me introduce them all and then invite you to give them a welcome. In the interest of time, I'll ask the panelists to summarize your remarks. We'll have time for a few questions before we're spirited off to a tour, and I have to wing my way with many of these cabinet officials back to Washington, D.C. Our first panelist is Mr. Eric Stallmer, President of Commercial Spaceflight Federation, one of our hosts here today for events last evening. Secondly is Kevin O'Connell, President of Innovative Analytics Training. Then there's Tom Stroop, President of Satellite Industry Association, and our fourth panelist is Dr. Mary Lynn Dittmer, President and CEO of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. These are four great champions of American entrepreneurship in space, and we're honored to have you all here. Thank you so very much. Mr. Stallmer, if you could get us started and briefly summarize your remarks, we'll move through the panel quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Cabinet Secretaries and members of the National Space Council, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here today. America's commercial space sector is growing in a pace and breadth, creating thousands of high-tech jobs driven by billions of dollars of private sector investment. Last year, we witnessed many breakthrough capabilities by U.S. commercial space companies. And just recently, as we discussed today, just last week, or a few weeks ago, SpaceX launched its Falcon Heavy, the first heavy lift rocket developed and launched with fully private funding. Blue Origin flew its New Shepard to space under the new RLV license, the first such revenue flight. They're also developing their own heavy lift vehicle with private sector funding, with private funding. But two significant challenges threatens America's goals in expanding our economic sphere and deepening into space. Commercial space transportation and remote sensing are growing at unprecedented rates, while new space applications like space manufacturing, resource prospecting, and human habitation are being introduced. As discussed earlier, our legal and regulatory and organizational frameworks have not caught up and are putting on the brakes on our current progress as well as our future possibilities. We need to strive for what economists call permissionless innovation in spaceflight. So long as public safety, international obligations, national security are not compromised, the presumption should be that a commercial space project can proceed. The regulation of space launch and re-entry to protect the public definitely warrant a license regime. However, the current regulations, written decades ago, based on 1980s technologies and operations, those rockets were expendable, very expensive, and infrequently launched and carried only one payloads. Spaceports also face inconsistent interpretation of regulations and requirements. The same rules are required to be implemented differently at different launch sites. And even modest improvements to spaceports' infrastructure can require new rounds of environmental review because it modifies the launch site operator's license. Our members at CSF are eager to work with the administration to modernize and streamline various licensing rules into one performance-based rule that preserves public safety without restricting industry speed and flexibility to invent a future where launches are more frequent, more affordable, and certainly more reliable. In many cases, rules can be made clearer and more concise with explanatory details left to guidance. Remote sensing in particular has been constrained by outdated regulations that often aren't faithfully implemented. And finally, it's time for the federal government to create a minimalistic process for approving a new commercial space activities by U.S. companies. H.R. 2809 provides narrowly tailored approach to government oversight of those activities, which is why CSF has endorsed this passage. With a commercial space industry unleashed to advance quickly as possible, the U.S. government needs to adapt to gain the maximum public benefit. Commercial companies can deliver results faster and cheaper for taxpayers, but only if federal agencies use commercial-friendly procurement methods that pay for results, not for just effort. For example, NASA should be encouraged to use competitively awarded, cost-shared, funded Space Act agreements to develop new space exploration capabilities so that the United States can affordably accelerate a return to the moon and voyages beyond. All space-related agencies should ask the question, can we partner before taking the traditional cost-plus contracting path? In conclusion, America's industrial paradigm for space has fundamentally changed, developing to a point where the U.S. government regulations and contracting practices are now our largest impediments. Now more than ever, we need the National Space Council, and we need you to take action and work with industry. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stallmer. Mr. O'Connell, you're recognized.
Mr. Vice President, distinguished cabinet members, invited guests. Good morning. My name is Kevin O'Connell. I'm the founder and CEO of Innovative Analytics and Training, a small private consulting firm in Washington, D.C. Today I'm going to bring forward to you my 25 years of writing and analyzing about commercial remote sensing for both government and commercial clients. I'd like to talk to you this morning about entrepreneurship on the next frontier, but if you'll allow me, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes showcasing the commercial remote sensing example, first from a perspective of its promise, but secondly from the continuing challenges that we have. And some of them have been mentioned already, and I'll go quickly over those. If you could imagine a traditional intelligence analyst or a scientist poring over a small number of satellite images, you have a somewhat outdated view of the world. American firms are at the cutting edge of the global commercial remote sensing market. They collect images with high resolution, with increasing frequency, and create unprecedented volumes of information. Other innovators are harnessing machine learning and other advanced analytic techniques to gain insights into that imagery. And yet other potential entrants to the market want to collect even more exquisite satellite data with other capabilities like radio frequency data and social media. These American firms have access to world-class satellite technology, and they're leveraging breakthroughs in cloud computing, communications, artificial intelligence, and visualization. Some analysts believe that remote sensing-based insights will become as important to commercial decision-making as accounting and mobile computing is today. In other words, we cannot talk about space without talking about the effects that they are already having on the ground today. Other capabilities like 3D image processing and augmented reality create breathtaking visualizations based on real-time data that create new levels of interaction and exploration. As we move deeper into the insights economy, commercial remote sensing will play an extraordinary role in providing detailed information about a wide range of topics on the ground. We all know the old phrase, "a picture is worth 1,000 words." Consider then what 1,000,000 pictures, richly detailed, efficiently organized, time-sequenced, and thoroughly analyzed might mean for what we understand about today and even tomorrow. For the U.S. commercial remote sensing industry, that's just one big step on the way to the next frontier. Next year marks, as has been said, the 25th anniversary of the modern regulatory system for commercial remote sensing. While there has been great progress, the process still hinders the speed of U.S. innovation. First of all, technological developments are outstripping our ability to think about policy and regulatory developments. Much of the current regulatory regime is outdated, reflecting technology and business processes from the early 2000s. Secondly, remote sensing impacts a very wide range of U.S. government interests, from national security and foreign policy to agriculture and weather. Too many stakeholders delay the licensing process, and as a result, sometimes restrict companies from providing more advanced remote sensing capabilities and the continuous flow of data expected in today's high-speed global markets in areas like agriculture, finance, insurance, and others. Third, because satellite imagery is crucial to our nation's defense and intelligence, it creates a level of caution that can slow or restrict innovations to market. We know that commercialization creates challenges for U.S. national security, but slowing down or delaying commercial innovation is neither consistent with U.S. policy nor likely to be a successful strategy. Commercial innovators face a new kind of innovator's dilemma. Those with the most innovative ideas wait the longest time for approval. As innovators languish in the regulatory process, foreign competitors can jump out and take advantage of the original precedent. By now, many of the remedies are well known and have been discussed here today: the need to shorten and hold accountable U.S. licensing timelines, the need to create the presumption of yes in the licensing process, and even the elevation to the cabinet level of hard decisions. Regulation of space-based capabilities must also take into account the other technologies that are coming forward in the market, such as drones and high-altitude air vehicles. In essence, remote sensing is moving rapidly from a traditional aerospace capability affecting a small number of important decisions to an information capability affecting thousands of decisions every single day. Even as we work to improve the environment for U.S. commercial firms, a new slate of issues, such as intellectual property, geospatial privacy, and foreign trade barriers, will have to be incorporated into our thinking. The 25-year case study of commercial remote sensing provides important lessons for how to think about the nation's broader space commerce pursuits. We need to do a better job, for example, of learning lessons across the board in areas like data rights, licensing, and data protection. We also need to do a better job of anticipating capabilities that are coming forward in the market. This will allow for early consideration of possible U.S. government use and public policy impact. We've done well, for example, in areas like non-Earth imaging and space situational awareness. Finally, we need to encourage strong continuing collaboration between the U.S. government and industry. We need to do a better job of harnessing industry information on issues like global competition, international regulatory activities, and emerging sources of innovation. The U.S. government cannot be the only source of good ideas on how to regulate on complex issues like space debris or space traffic management. To close, U.S. government and industry roles are changing, so we do need to think about new strategies to advance policy and regulatory mechanisms to stay as close to technology as possible. We recognize that U.S. leadership is as much about shaping the global environment, setting standards, encouraging effective international partnerships, as it is about being first in space and in how we ultimately use the data in thousands of applications on the ground every day. As in so many other technology innovation areas, both past and present, ours must be a game of moving forward, not playing defense. Thank you, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Very well done. Tom Stroop, Satellite Industry Association, thank you for being with us.
Mr. Vice President and distinguished members of the Council, I'm honored to be here today in this extraordinary venue. I'm Tom Strout, President of the Satellite Industry Association. SIA is a U.S.-based trade association representing the leading satellite operators, manufacturers, launch providers, and ground equipment suppliers who serve commercial, civil, and military markets. I would like to take this opportunity to focus on three areas: innovation, spectrum certainty, and sustainable space operations. Today, the satellite industry supports over 211,000 U.S. jobs, including tens of thousands of well-paying manufacturing positions. The satellite industry's 2017 estimated revenue was $260.5 billion, which does not reflect revenues from the many businesses made possible by our services. Satellites are constantly operating in the background of space, enabling the American economy in ways consumers might not be aware. Beyond strictly financial metrics, however, our very way of life depends on the benefits we receive from satellite-based services and applications. Satellites, communications, Earth observation, and position, navigation, and timing have transformed how we communicate, how we map, navigate, and see our world, how we produce food and energy, conduct banking, predict the weather, ensure national security, and so much more. The ubiquity of satellite coverage provides access to areas across the globe that are otherwise unreachable. Satellites provide telecommunication services to U.S. citizens, from those in rural regions without terrestrial internet access to scientists at the South Pole, and have proven critical in areas of natural disasters, such as the hurricane-stricken areas of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Satellite imagery is also critical for disaster response, allowing for the surveying of damage, not just by emergency management officials, but by average citizens from across the globe. All of the breakthroughs we've seen because of satellite technology should not be taken for granted. They depend upon our industry's ability to access spectrum. In order to sustain and meet the growing demand for satellite services, we encourage regulators to continue to allocate sufficient spectrum for satellite use, both domestically and via U.S. support at the upcoming World Radio Communications Conference. Regulatory streamlining and certainty also are critical for the advancement of new technologies in the industry. With plans to launch satellite constellations of hundreds, if not thousands, of satellites over the next decade, it is crucial that regulation be adaptable to new technologies. Finally, sustainable development must also be at the heart of innovations and advancements of the satellite industry. As a shared natural resource, it is our responsibility to ensure we protect space and ensure its availability for use by future generations. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Well done, Tom. Appreciate it. Marilyn Dittmer is with the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, and we're grateful for you here.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Members of the National Space Council, Executive Secretary Pace, thank you for inviting me to speak on entrepreneurship and economic expansion in the new frontier. Entrepreneurial risk-taking and innovation are without doubt engines for economic development in space, beginning in low Earth orbit and expanding toward the moon. At the same time, government programs such as the Space Launch System, the crew vehicle Orion, and the ground systems necessary to support both government and industry provide much-needed infrastructure for further economic development. Even more importantly, they maintain national constancy of purpose as a signal to other governments of the U.S. commitment to leadership in space. As has already been discussed, the nature of the policy and regulatory framework guiding our collective efforts is crucial. I would like to address the third rail, acquisition reform. The fiscal, programmatic, reporting, and management burdens associated with the often glacial pace of traditional contracting can hardly be overstated. As an aside, when I was asked by a member of the presidential transition team what single thing could most advance exploration of space, my answer was FAR 2.0. Of more importance, even alarm, the slow nature of government procurements creates barriers to technological advancement, posing a threat to our national security and our leadership in space. This is not to say that traditional contracting should be abandoned. For example, cost-plus contracts for managing large-scale development programs provide stability, reduce industry risk, and ensure sustainment of the U.S. industrial base over the years or decades that are often required for these programs. That said, the means to leave the starting gate with far more agility than currently exists, as well as renewed mechanisms for accountability and constraints on schedule and cost growth, are of primary interest in reform. Other transactional agreements, or OTAs, represent a different approach, not subject to the oversight required of federal contracts. OTAs provide flexibility, but also increased risk of reduced accountability and transparency. For this reason, the vast majority of them are relatively low value. Notable exceptions include the Commercial Orbital Transportation System, or COTS, and the Commercial Crew Development Program, both at NASA. During COTS, the government invested a substantial amount of the costs and left development in the hands of private enterprise. The resulting systems were developed at much less cost to the government than a traditional cost-plus contract would have achieved. The story is less clear with crewed systems, however, wherein the balance between contractor discretion, government insight, and the risk to human lives continues to be debated. I turn next to public-private partnerships, or P3s, which have advanced both the A and the S in NASA, aeronautics and space. P3s take many forms: subsidies, government-backed loans, government-owned contractor-operated entities, repurposing of public assets, just to name a few. The success of P3s hinges on informed allocation of risk to each side of the partnership, a realistic business case, which is an indispensable requirement, and the means to incentivize business to align private objectives with the public interest. As a path forward into deep space, P3s carry much promise, but as on Earth, they require a carefully thought-out set of requirements, processes, and objectives. Each of these models attempts to balance risk, discretion, cost, incentives, and mission objectives in different ways. I cannot say this strongly enough. Decisions regarding which approach is best for a given objective cannot be driven by ideology, whether political or philosophical. Rather, an acquisition framework that drives successful program development and execution, encourages private investment and market-driven solutions, and maintains the ability to adapt to always changing external realities should be our collective goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Lynn. Very well done. Let me maybe ask a question of the panel. I have a feeling I'm gonna get word that we need to be moving to our next appointment. But maybe I could start with you, Dr. Dittmer. That given your extensive experience on the space station, the President has announced our plan to transition to a different model for America's presence in low Earth orbit. One of our previous panelists said, I thought rather insightfully, where we would transition the government to more tenant and customer rather than landlord, so that we could focus on human exploration and pushing the boundaries. Since you all represent this industry, could each of you maybe give me 1 minute on where the where are the opportunities, where are the challenges, what should this council be aware of as we seek to make that transition? And Dr. Dittmer on the space station, you've forgotten more about it than I'll ever learn.
So I'll start by saying that the demand side is as important as the supply side in this case. And so finding additional ways that have already been discussed, but many other ways to encourage demand to develop, especially in low Earth orbit, is critical. I think we also need to establish some criteria for that transition. Those should include readiness to assume role of the commercial industry, and there's certainly a number of efforts that are underway right now. A clear strategy for continued expanded international collaboration, both in low Earth orbit and then toward the moon, is very important. The framework that guided the development of the station has enabled everything that's happened there, and I think that's critical. A plan for ensuring that critical exploration technologies can continue to be developed. So, for example, environmental control is very important. Astronauts like to be able to breathe when they're in deep space. So we need to make sure that we have a working system that will enable that over a long period of time in deep space. And then the nature of the vehicle itself. What is it capable of? What is the follow-on capable of? Sort of what do we want to do with it going forward?
Good insights. Anyone else? Just a quick shot on
just very
transition.
Quickly, I would also address procurement reform, because I think very often, as the military is a large customer of the industry, making a transition from viewing themselves as purchasing satellites to purchasing services, in addition to the unique satellites that they have a specific need, but looking at how they can acquire satellite services more quickly would be important.
Great. Kevin, Eric?
Just briefly, I think anticipating the kinds of capabilities that are coming forth in the market, paying explicit attention to U.S. government use, to public policy concerns, et cetera, something that needs to be done proactively, not wait until people show up with a new capability for licensing.
And I think, just to touch on what Mary Lynn said, the idea of having a smooth transition plan, avoiding any kind of gap, and really utilizing a lot of the innovation and the technology that the commercial industry is driving right now, whether it be through habitat modules or new transportation systems, or just the experiments that are taking place on the International Space Station. I think there's remarkable technologies that are being developed at a rapid pace, and we want to incorporate them throughout the process of this transition.
That's great. That's great. Join me in thanking this outstanding panel. Great insights, great overview. Thank you so much. Great job. Well, to members of the National Space Council, I think this has been a great discussion. Before we adjourn, I'd like to task a few items to assign to Administrator Lightfoot. I appreciate you working with Commerce and State to develop a strategy to develop the framework for greater cooperation with our private sector partners and, as appropriate, international partners as well. I'd welcome your recommendations by our meeting this fall that we could forward to the President in the form of a decision memorandum. And we already, I think we touched on a number of issues in the previous recommendation, but this panel's been a great affirmation, I think, of the overall direction, but we'll take your steady counsel on this on an ongoing basis. With that, let me thank all the members of the National Space Council, especially the members of the Cabinet who are here, distinguished members of the User Advisory Group. I encourage all of you that have an interest in the work of the National Space Council to avail yourself of the extraordinary women and men who have stepped forward to offer advice and counsel to the work of the National Space Council. I want to thank the extraordinary men and women of the Kennedy Space Center for their hospitality, and to each and every one of you, thank you for your great interest in this. The work will continue, and America is leading in space again. Thanks to all of you. Thank you. God bless you. It's good to be with you all.